My name is Mike Cleland, and I'm a member of the steering committee of Sustainable Prosperity, which is, of course, one of the sponsors of this event. Very pleased to have the opportunity to do that. As I say, an important topic and two extremely well-qualified speakers. I believe bios of the speakers are available, so I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just very briefly, our first speaker is going to be Peter Wooders, who's on my immediate right, and he's with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the senior economist for climate change, energy, and trade. Peter is based in Geneva and has 20 years of experience across the energy sector with a particular specialization in electricity generation. To Peter's right is Dave Sawyer, who is the proprietor of Sawyer Environmental Economic Consulting. Dave's work has covered a wide variety of projects in the areas of environmental, natural resource, and regulatory economics. I've just met Peter, but I know Dave from a ways back, and I'm personally familiar with some of the very good work he's done over the years with the now long gone National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy. So welcome Peter to Canada and Dave to the room. Just briefly, for sustainable prosperity, the question of subsidies is something that I'd characterize as, in a sense, as a corollary of our core mission. SP believes fundamentally that we should be pricing and people should be seeing the price, the real prices of environmental externalities. Some of them have to be regulated, a lot of them can be priced directly. But before you can build the new policy, you often need to clean up the rubble of the old, including subsidies, which are often working in opposite directions. Subsidies are an instrument with important and often, I would go so far as to say, mainly negative economic, environmental, and fiscal implications. And they're an instrument that governments, probably since the invention of governments, have been lamentably active in for a very, very long time. This topic encompasses both producer and consumer subsidies, and I think our speakers will talk about both of those and talk about the relative impacts of them. I'm going to add that for energy policy purposes, this needs to encompass all energy. Energy production and consumption can have a wide variety of environmental effects, of which carbon emissions and climate change are the most obvious. Pushing people away from fossil fuels while actively inducing them to consume more non-fossil energy is, in fact, perverse. So subsidies need to be looked at across the board. Subsidies in general are inefficient, generating free riders, rent-seeking, and a whole variety of moral hazard issues. They are far from a costless instrument to deploy. And they often become entitlements. And even after the rationale for their existence is long gone, they are often extremely difficult to remove. Sometimes subsidies are unavoidable. Governments need to act. They're the instrument that is at hand for a variety of reasons. But they are almost never an ideal solution, and they're certainly not an ideal solution if they make it harder to meet our environmental objectives, which, of course, today is the focus of our discussion. Canada has made some progress in this area. We've also moved in the wrong direction in this area in several respects, and we've made commitments under the G20 process, but there's a lot more that needs to be done, and our speakers are going to talk to us about that. Each of them is going to take about 15 to 20 minutes to outline their thoughts, and then we will open it up for general discussion. And I will ask each of you to hold your questions until after both have spoken. So with that, and no further introductions necessary, I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, Mike. Excellent introduction. I think you've covered most of my material already with the moral hazard arguments, but also I think a very key point there that even if you decide that subsidies are not what you want to do, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be reformed. The reform process is a difficult one. And I wanted to talk today from IISD's perspective, from the Global Subsidies Initiative, about some of our thoughts on reform, and also to give you some ideas as well on what sort of roles different people can play in that reform effort. A little bit on IISD and its Global Subsidies Initiative, what we do. Number one thing on our subsidy work, we started working on subsidies in 2005, set up the Global Subsidies Initiative as a part of IISD. Number one, transport fuels in developing countries. A lot of the world's subsidies by scale are gasoline, our diesel, underpriced in developing countries. And that's sort of probably the main source of subsidy worldwide. So our basic position on this as Global Subsidy Initiative is we act to support the reform of energy subsidies where we believe that those act against sustainable development. In energy terms, in fossil fuel energy terms, a working assumption is that most subsidies do act against sustainable development. If there's a better solution available, as Mike mentioned, then let's use that. And in terms of something like transferring benefits to poor segments of the population through low gasoline prices, if there is a cash transfer or a welfare system or something else we can do, that is generally better targeted and cheaper and has less adverse effects. How we try and work, the service GSI provides to become and act as a trusted partner and expert advisor to governments. That's where we want to be. But we also, I think it's very important to stress the other side of the debate as well, and the longer we've been working in this subject, the more people will say, well, you're against fossil fuel subsidies, you're against this, what are you for? And we have to actually, to get into the influencing role and into the big debates, we have to say what we are for, and we need to therefore propose sustainable alternatives around renewables, green economy. We work a lot with energy-intensive industry and climate change to help them become part of a sustainable future, but the need there to propose sustainable alternatives. Sort of things we do, we've had very interesting experience last year or two working in biofuels in the European Union. There are large subsidies to biofuels, somewhere around 6 billion euros per year going to bioethanol and to biodiesel. We found with our work that most of those are against sustainable development, and this is a picture here from the European Parliament event that was held towards the end of last year. There was a vote last week in September 11th in European Parliament about capping the amount of biofuels that can come from crop-based sources. And that event got very, very interesting, very heated, very lively. We had some interesting to and fro's on that. This is a Malaysian official. We held a workshop last year in Indonesia. Sort of top tip here, if you ever need to have a workshop for Southeast Asian officials in November, Bali is a fantastic place to do it. And so this was the representative from Malaysia doing an exercise that we had about if there were a $50 increase in the world oil price, what would you do? So we worked there with Southeast Asian officials. We did some work, we've done a lot of work on communication strategies recently around renewables with the IEA. And then there's a picture of Vietnam. Vietnam's got a big crisis in generating enough money to build up its electricity system as it grows. And Vietnamese electricity demand is growing at 10% per year. That's very, very hard to raise the investment capital to build that system, especially when the consumer's not putting in, not covering the financial costs of its consumption. Little picture here on some of the subsidies that may undermine sustainable development, and if you look at those, I won't go through these. In the centre there are the economic, environmental, social problems, and around the outside you'll see that on some of those we know a lot about them. On consumer subsidies for fossil fuels, worldwide somewhere between $400 and $700 billion per year, depending on the oil price effectively. We know less about producer subsidies. We at GSI believe they're at least $100 billion a year. Biofuels we have some numbers on. Nuclear, no one knows anything. This sort of stuff is not publicised. It's not a general government function to list out what they consider to be subsidies and publicise that and have a debate around it. A lot more known on agriculture and fisheries. Big debates there in World Trade Organization. Irrigation area we're looking at again. How big are irrigation subsidies worldwide? In which countries? We just don't know at the moment. So when we get involved in these different areas, it's at different places. On the fossil fuel subsidy side, you can get into influence. On the irrigation side, you've got to do some fairly fundamental research. International experience, international attention of this issue has started to get big in 2009 with the Pittsburgh announcement by the G20 that their membership was committed to phasing out subsidies that were inefficient and led to wasteful consumption. You can question whether that particular G20 initiative has achieved very much, but it has achieved an enormous amount of political attention internationally and within countries. One of the things it's led to is the creation, with GSI's help, of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Group, who I'm sure you're all fully aware of, who are a group of 8 countries, non-G20 members, who are committed to holding the G20 countries to account, and also a very nice size of a size of the group to be able to act in something like UNFCCC, where they're now active, or WTO, World Trade Organization, or with G20, and sort of say, let's combine our diplomatic efforts and try and make some progress on this issue. And a point there from Tim Grosser, who's been one of the champions of this, a New Zealand minister responsible for climate change, about the incoherency of the government of the UNFCCC trying to put a price on carbon or reduce carbon, while at the same time putting a negative price on through subsidies. I wanted to focus today on fossil fuels. As Mike pointed out, that's not the only subject here, and a coherent view of the energy system is an essential place to start and an essential place to be aware of. But just thinking about, just for today and only having a few minutes here, I've got a whole set here of citizens' guides. This is something we do when we go into a country, which lays out how big are subsidies in particular countries for a general layman audience. Who gets those subsidies? Give them some context. What are they as a percent of GDP or compared to the budget spent on health or education? If they were reformed, what could the money be spent on? And that's it. It doesn't get into a value judgment or anything like that. And we work a lot. This is a point I wanted to make today to this audience, that we work a lot with local partners. In this case, the Indonesian Essential Services Reform NGO. They're more advocacy than we are, and they're obviously much better at speaking Bahasa, much better connected, good networks, and good spheres of influence. The head of the IISR, his wife is the daughter of a pretty important ex-minister, and so on it goes. And that sort of links that you need to be able to make progress in country on fossil fuel subsidy reform. We don't have those, obviously, being based in Geneva, but other people do. Some partnerships in Indonesia. We've done a bit with the World Bank on focus groups. We're working on ADB about setting up inventories for subsidies, on about impact analysis, and then a whole set of IISR. This is the University of Gadjah Mada, the Indonesian Institute for Energy Economics, the Consumers Association, Antara Press Agency, and then there's one more international, 350.org. And in order to sort of progress, the sort of theme of my presentation today, to progress towards a reform, we need to build civil society partnerships and consensus and have roles, people who are good at advocacy, people who've got good contacts, people who are good at economics, bring them all together. And I think there is a role here for international organizations to do that if you have the strategy and the vision. And here's an example here. This is an event done by the University of Gadjah Mada, which is a couple of 100 kilometers out of Indonesia. They set up, amazingly, at 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning, a public event which loads of people came to, we couldn't believe it, to discuss subsidies. They had people from two of the main political parties, a couple of academics, and also somebody from Pertamina, the oil company. And that sort of public debate, we think, is a real key issue here. People think they know quite a lot about subsidies. When you get a bit deeper, you find out they don't actually know that much. And there's a big role here for people to supply good quality information into the debate. I think Dave will probably come on to this next, but even in a country like Canada, that's an essential thing to do too. Building support, that's the Beatles in 1963 or 65, I think it's Shea Stadium. So this is the sort of thing we want to happen, people going, subsidies, they're just terrible, you must get rid of them. It's not quite happening yet. But to build that support, what do you need to do? Governments need to organise themselves internally. We need to gather information, understand perceptions. We need to raise awareness. So political economy stuff. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there's only so far you can go with modelling and with technical analysis and with economic analysis. A lot of this is a political economy issue in country. We've put together a big, thick compendium of a guidebook here about how you might go about the process of subsidy reform. We feel there is a common process for countries, not common solutions, but a common process. We've sought here to analyse and put together all the international experience. Here across the bar here, do some research, choose mechanisms, implement, and then a whole bunch of advice, which you can see if you want to, in the report itself, about internal, external building support mechanisms. What this tends to suggest is that there's often an opportunity in a country every year around the budget process to have a new pricing policy and a range of supportive mechanisms. And then in the longer term, you might have to go through 2 or 3 budget processes to get to where you want to get to. What's going to happen here? And then, okay, and then the general awareness raising process. International side, I mentioned the Friends group from GSI as well. We are working with that friends group. We're also working closely with G20 and APEC. It's pretty fragile. The G20 commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies was done essentially to fill an item that was in the agenda, but the US has continued to support that agenda item, and it's hugely important politically for the issue, so we keep going with it. APEC's done a similar thing. This year we've managed to get some progress in UNFCCC. We've got some of the lead negotiators to sit down together and sort of say, we think there is a role for UNFCCC to play in subsidy reform. How might we do that? And it comes on to NAMAs, it comes on to reporting mechanisms, MRV, all sorts of stuff. I went to Moscow earlier this year I was co-chair of the Civil 20 organization, which was one of the groups set up by the Russian presidency to feed into the G20. They took some recommendations. And we think there is a role for IISD, for others, as a thought leader. One of the things I would say about subsidies, which is kind of good and bad, good for us is that not many organisations tend to prioritise it. Everyone's got an interest in subsidy reform, but it's not their main work programme, and it's not what they focus on. So somebody who is focused on it has an advantage. Bad in that it is quite a bitty subject, and we need to bring together pieces of the puzzle and bring together actors. We did some peer review work just to show the sort of slow pace of G20. The last couple of years they've been considering the voluntary peer reviews for their membership of their quantity of subsidies and their reform plans. This year they've finally agreed that they should have a voluntary peer review mechanism, and we put together some examples for them of how they might do that. And the G20 very interesting, I think, in that it's essentially a finance minister's organisation. This sort of energy issue is not something that they understand very well, and it's not something they're focused on. So we're really competing with attention against sort of much more, to them, more important and more pressing issues. Fossil fuel subsidies producers. I was talking to Alan Freeman earlier, just before the meeting today, about how ministries are typically split when we look at countries. So going sort of internationally here, the consumer subsidy, low energy prices, is typically a developing country issue. Producer subsidies upstream. Our belief is that most countries who are oil and gas producers, coal producers, have those subsidies. We don't know how big they are, we don't know their impacts because the work hasn't been done. And we often see that those countries' ministries are split. Ministry of Environment will be for subsidy reform. Ministry of Finance is typically for subsidy reform because they've got to pick up the bill. Ministry of Energy is typically against subsidy reform, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs is seeing which way the wind's blowing internationally and following that. But very typical split is, so it's hard to get a national consensus on an issue here, and sort of who speaks for government and who is prioritising the issue. We've done that. One thing that we've had to do on this issue, and Dave's work, before he joined IISD, he wrote a big report for us on Canada's oil and gas subsidies from federal and the three big producing provinces for oil and gas. Not many people have gone to the trouble of working through all the different policies from government and sort of saying, this is what we think are subsidies, these are how big we think they are, and then going to the third stage, which Dave did do with that work, of saying, therefore, what are their impacts, is again very, very rare. So it's a really open field here. Looking forward for us, for IISD on this, we're going to do a bit more work on the Arctic, and sort of say there are Arctic's opening up for energy production. Why does that need to be subsidised? Is that a good public policy or not? And I think the answer there would benefit from a bit more research and a bit more of a debate. And of course, Canada has the presidency of that Arctic Council going forward. A few thoughts to with on moving ahead with supporting national reform. Good research is not enough to achieve influence. I think that's very clear. I guess that works for any sort of policy change, but we notice that very much on the subsidy thing. Communications is key, good partnerships are key. This is political economy, this is politics of reform, this is change management. It takes time to build trust and credibility. This is more a sort of a message to our donors to some extent. People like World Bank or the Danish government say, we want to go and do something now in Malaysia, we want to go do something in Vietnam, what should we do? And we say, well look, it's going to take you 1.5, 2 years to build those partnerships in country, to build trust, to build credibility. Let's try and partner together, and don't see this as a quick win. Just by pointing out that subsidies tend to be bad for sustainable development, that doesn't get them reformed. It's a much longer process than that. And then finally, preempting my own point, the reform is not a process that happens overnight. You need a longer term perspective for this. Now, I could talk for hours and hours about this stuff. You probably don't want to hear that. There are a couple of my colleagues in the room I should point out as well. Melissa with the camera and Maxine here from IISD's office in Ottawa. So, Ottawa, I'm learning. But I thank you for, I tried to order a banana earlier and the woman just looked at me. I said, banana. I got that right. So, thank you for your attention. Everything that we do for Global Subsidies Initiative is designed to be public, it's designed to help inform debate, designed to help other people in this field to get into it. All on our website's there. I'm around after the meeting as well, so I look forward to our discussion and thank you for your attention.